So as we heard last week, when Charles V abdicated in 1556 in Brussels, he left the Holy Roman Empire to his brother Ferdinand, and Spain and parts of Italy, including the Duchy of Milan and the Kingdom of Naples, and what came to be known as the Spanish Netherlands, what we call Belgium and Holland now, to his son Philip II. The Spanish Netherlands appear as that light green area on the northwestern edge of the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire appears on this map as a solid block of green, but it was in fact a very loose confederation of electorates, duchies, principalities, free imperial cities, bishoprics, and other assorted political entities. We'll hear more later about the problems Philip's uncle Ferdinand and his successors faced in their attempts to manage all this later, but right now we want to deal with what was possibly the biggest political and military challenge Philip faced during his reign, holding on to the Spanish Netherlands, which were separated from Spain by 1,000 miles of French-controlled land and what came to be English and Dutch-controlled water. When Philip returned to Spain after his victory over the French at San Quentin, he left his half-sister, Margaret of Parma, an illegitimate daughter of Charles V, in charge as regent for the Spanish Netherlands. She's usually considered to have been well-intentioned, but she was faced with a set of circumstances that made peace in the Spanish Netherlands almost impossible. This portrait of her is by Antonio Moro, as he was known in Spain, and Antonis More, as he was known in the Spanish Netherlands, whose work we've seen several times before. This is a portrait of Cardinal Antoine Granville, or Granvella as the Spanish called him, who was to emerge from her council of advisors as her chief of staff, and this portrait is also by Antonis More. Granville had impressive credentials. He had been a close advisor to Charles V and had arranged the wedding between Philip and Mary Tudor. But what Philip really wanted was to govern the Spanish Netherlands himself, only he wanted to do this from Spain, and this made things difficult for Margaret and Granville. It took a minimum of a month to send a message to Madrid and get a response, and often by the time the response arrived, the situation had changed. By 1564, Philip's policies, insisting on the right to appoint bishops sympathetic to Spain, using the Inquisition to suppress opposition to his views of how religion should be practiced, heavy taxation, and what was generally taken to be a lack of respect for rights granted to the provinces of the Spanish Netherlands by his father and confirmed by himself, had created a deep undercurrent of resentment among many Catholics as well as Protestants. This is the former residence of Granville, now the Palais de Justice, the Hall of Justice in Malines, a suburb of Brussels. In 1564, Granville, who was blamed by many for much of what was considered wrong with the Spanish regency, and whose sometimes high-handed attitude was resented by Margaret herself, was asked by Philip to take a leave of absence. But he never returned to his former position. His diplomatic career did not end, however. Philip continued to request his advice, and he was one of those who were to be most responsible for putting together the alliance that won the Battle of Lepanto. Granville's departure certainly did not lessen the tension between the Spanish and their subjects. Counts Egmont and Horn and William, Prince of Orange, had as late as 1560 all been more than loyal to Philip. Egmont had helped win the Battle of San Quentin, Horn had commanded the fleet which took Philip to Spain after that, and William had been one of the chief negotiators on the Spanish side, along with Granville and the Duke of Alva, when the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis was being worked out. By 1564, however, they all had serious reservations about the Spanish. By 1567, despite or maybe because of the efforts of the Inquisition, Protestants were taking the offensive, burning monasteries, sacking churches on a large scale, and Margaret felt compelled to sign an agreement that, in essence, allowed Protestant worship where it was being practiced at the time of the agreement. But Philip was not pleased with this arrangement and commissioned the Duke of Alva to take 10,000 Spanish troops to join those already in the Netherlands and restore Spanish and Catholic control. William of Orange had already left for Germany to recruit Protestants to fight against the Spanish. This is the Palacio Loria in Madrid now, where the descendants of the Duke of Alva still live. And that's a portrait of him attributed to Titian there at the left. Another member of this family will figure in the lecture on Goya next quarter. The 13th Duchess of Alva was at least a very close friend of Goya's and is of course popularly imagined to have posed for the picture known as the Maja Desnuda. The Duke himself here had been a lifelong soldier since helping when he was only 17 to defeat Francis I at Pavia. He was the man primarily responsible for Charles V's victory over the German Protestants at Mulberg, which Charles commemorated with Titian's equestrian portrait of him, which we saw last time. And as I just mentioned, he was, with his future enemy William of Orange, involved in negotiating the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis. Alva arrived in Brussels in August of 1567 and took over the regency from Margaret, who left for Italy. He then invited Egmont and Horn to dinner, took them into custody, and imprisoned them. Guarding them, however, required the use of 3,000 troops, and when William of Orange went on the offensive with his motley army of Dutch Protestants, German mercenaries, French Huguenots, and anyone else who wanted to or could be paid to fight the Spanish, Alva ordered Egmont and Horn, who were doomed anyway, to be executed in the Grand Place in Brussels, here in front of the so-called Maison du Roi. This building is popularly supposed to have been the headquarters of the Spanish, but they actually used the buildings up on the Coudenberg Hill, where the old palace of the Counts of Flanders used to be, a spot that's now occupied by the Belgian Royal Palace. The Maison du Roi itself was originally built in the 16th century, but it was almost entirely reconstructed in the 19th. This is the monument that honors Egmont and Horn now in Brussels. It used to be in front of the Maison du Roi where they were executed. Now it's in the nearby Place du Petit Sablon. The date of the execution of Egmont and Horn, June 5, 1568, is regarded by the Dutch as something like their 4th of July. It's taken to mark the beginning, the definitive beginning of what they call the 80 Years' War, the war against the Spanish, that didn't really end until the official acknowledgement of Dutch independence at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. This is the same Egmont, incidentally, who's the hero of Goethe's play, for which Beethoven wrote a well-known overture and incidental music. Alva then won victories over William and his brother Louis, but the English captured the ship carrying the gold that was supposed to pay Alva's army, and he was forced to begin a policy of heavily taxing even his Catholic subjects that probably did as much as anything to make his failure certain. This is another portrait of Alva now, also attributed to Titian. We're not going to go through all the details, all the battles, all the atrocities, and they were not all committed by the Spanish, that fill up the chronicles of the Netherlands during his regency. The bottom line is that despite the fact that he could boast that he'd killed 18,000 rebels by 1574, there was still no end to the struggle in sight. The Bishop of Namur said that Alva had, in fact, by his policies, done more harm to the Catholic cause in the Spanish Netherlands than Luther and Calvin combined. And this war was much more complicated than just Catholics versus Protestants. Egmont and Horn were both still Catholic when they were executed, and William the Silent didn't make his famous statement that he was Calvis et Calvinista, bald and Calvinist, until 1574. Philip relied way too much on the theory, the hope, that Flemish Catholics would wholeheartedly support the Spanish cause, and that just isn't what happened. Alva was recalled to Spain and replaced by Don Luis de Requesens. This is Alva's tomb in the monastery of Santo Domingo in Salamanca, the place we heard about in connection with Columbus. His recall from the Netherlands did not end Alva's career. When Philip put in his claim on Portugal in 1580, Alva, by then 72 years old, led the army again, this time to victory. The case has been argued that we should not study history because it keeps alive old animosities, the desire for revenge and so on, and maybe there's something to this. The America of the year 2000 is about as unaware of the course of history that preceded it as any civilization since the Middle Ages, and it is, despite being imperfect, about as tolerant a place as has ever existed. Maybe that's part of the reason. My daughter has a friend named Alva, and I'm sure her parents have no idea of the terror and hatred that name once inspired. They just picked it because it has a euphonious ring to it. But you'll find about as many children named Alva in Holland today, though, as you'll find named Cromwell in Dublin. Here's a portrait of Philip's real nemesis in the Spanish Netherlands, William, Prince of Orange and Count of Nassau, known as William the Silent, and the picture again is by Antoine Moore, and you're hearing what's now the Dutch national anthem, William of Nassau, by the latter's friend, Philip von Marnix. William was probably lucky that he was in Germany when Alva arrived and invited Egmont and Horn to dinner, because he might have been tempted to go too. Unlike Alva, he had no reliable standing army and didn't do well in pitched battles against the Spanish, but his guerrilla tactics and the fact that, as Requesens put it, his men were fighting for their homes on their own land made him a dangerous opponent. Requesens was much more willing to compromise than Alva had been, but William, feeling that he was getting the upper hand, would settle for only what would amount to a complete capitulation by the Spanish. Requesens died less than 2 years after he arrived and was replaced by Don Juan, Philip's half-brother, the hero of Lepanto, but as we heard last time, he was no more successful than his predecessors had been, and died in 1578 to be replaced by Philip's nephew, Alessandro Farnese, the Duke of Parma, the son of the former regent, Margaret of Parma. More of a realist, without being really less of a soldier than Juan, he recognized that for all practical purposes the northern provinces of the Netherlands were lost, and that Spain should concentrate on holding on to what it might reasonably expect to be able to keep in the Catholic South. In 1579, the League of Arras was formed, the signatories to which essentially represented the part of the Spanish Netherlands we now call Belgium, but which was still called the Spanish Netherlands until the War of the Spanish Succession, about which we'll hear next quarter. Here Spanish sovereignty would be recognized, and only Catholicism would be legal. Likewise, the northern Protestant provinces formed the Union of Utrecht, creating the United Provinces we now call somewhat confusingly the Netherlands or Holland, though Holland is actually just the name of the most important of these provinces. This is a later portrait of William the Silent by a member of the Kay family of painters, portrait painters primarily. He was appointed the first stadtholder, or ruler, in effect, of the United Provinces in 1581, and thereby became William I. The United Provinces were in theory to constitute a republic, but the stadtholdership was made hereditary in his family in 1584. The formation of these two separate political entities out of the former Spanish Netherlands was not the end of the story, however, and the question of exactly who was to control what was debated on battlefields and around conference tables for many years. For a long time, the area of what we would call now northern Belgium, around Bruges, Antwerp, and so on, was a real battleground claimed by both the Spanish and the United Provinces. Almost as big a problem for William as the Spanish in the south were the fights between various Protestant sects that could go on in the north. We'll hear more about this in the future as well. This is the Prinzenhof in Delft, now which William made his de facto capital, and which is now a museum. In 1582, William had been shot in the face by a would-be assassin hoping to collect the bounty that Philip had put on his head, but amazingly he recovered. Then attempts were made to poison him and to blow him up. Finally, in 1584, a fellow named Balthazar Gerard shot and killed him on the staircase that still stands inside here. The hole made by the bullet looks today like something that might have been made by a howitzer shell or two, but that's because souvenir hunters have gouged out pieces of the wall where he was shot and in which the bullets which were fired were lodged. Gerard did not live to spend the bounty. He was caught and tortured to death. William was succeeded as stadtholder by his son Maurice, who would move his headquarters to The Hague, of which Delft, where the Prinzenhof is really just a suburb. This is William's tomb now in the new church, as it's called in Delft. The sculpture is by Hendrik de Keyser, often regarded as the greatest Dutch sculptor ever, but you won't find his name in many standard histories of art. As we'll see later this quarter, when Philip died in 1598, Philip the King of Spain, he willed the Spanish Netherlands to his favorite daughter Isabella Clara Eugenia and her husband Albert, and in 1609 they and Maurice, William's son, would sign a 12-year truce that would at least prove another stepping stone, I guess, toward ending the fighting, though Spain would continue to claim the Netherlands, the northern provinces, the United Provinces, until 1648. We'll also eventually hear about William's descendants across the Channel, too. His great-grandson, also known as William of Orange, will go off to become King of England in 1688. And believe it or not, he'll actually make an alliance with Spain to keep Louis XIV out of Holland. Now, the most important painter in the Spanish Netherlands during this period was Peter Brugel, and I might say he spelled his name B-R-U-E-G-E-L and undoubtedly pronounced it Brugel. This is The Fall of the Rebel Angels, an early picture by him in the Brussels Musée de Beaux-Arts. Brugel was born about 1525, probably in Breda, or actually in the town of Brugel, maybe, which is right nearby. In any case, he was born in the part of the Spanish Netherlands that eventually became part of the United Provinces, or Holland. Early in his career, he worked for a forger named Cloak, for whom he made copies and drawings from which paintings and engravings were made that were passed off as the work of Hieronymus Bosch. And several of Brugel's own pictures seem, like this one, not surprisingly, to show the influence of Bosch, who spent his life in 's-Hertogenbosch, which is only about 20 miles from Breda. Brugel was to have a very short creative life. Almost all the pictures we have by him were painted in about a 10-year period, from 1559 to his death in 1569 at just the age of 44. And that's not a lot of time for style to evolve in the life of an artist, but there is a general agreement about the order of the kinds of subject matter he liked to paint that helps date his pictures, and he did date at least some of them himself. I might mention at the outset here, too, that he had a son, Peter, known as the Younger, or Hell Brugel, another son, Jan, known as Velvet Brugel, and there are more and lesser members of the family who are also painters, but the Brugel is Peter the Elder, our subject here. This is another apparently Bosch-influenced picture by him known as Mad Meg, but what's really going on here defies analysis. Is this the expression of some bizarre inner vision of Brugel's own, and we should, on the basis of that, maybe call him a Mannerist? Maybe, but to put him in the same stylistic category as Tintoretto and El Greco, as in fact is sometimes done, is certainly to suggest he had more in common with them than he does. Some of the pictures we'll see were inspired by literary sources from the Bible to Dutch proverbs, so this might make reference to some Flemish or Dutch story or saying yet to be discovered. Meg or whoever with sword drawn may be storming hell there at the left, but what's all that junk she's carrying? Compared to this nightmarish episode, Bosch looks easy to interpret. At the right, it looks like some demon-led army is storming a city defended only by women. Some have seen in this a kind of feminist statement with Meg as a sort of Joan of Arc, but that just doesn't sound very convincing to me, although I don't have any better idea. One of Bruegel's most famous pictures is The Triumph of Death, now in the Prado. Since Brugel lived through the period in the 1560s when the horrors of war could be seen throughout the Spanish Netherlands, it's tempting to think that this might reflect Bruegel's observation of these things. It's even been argued by at least 3 important scholars that this represents his view of the atrocities committed by the Spanish. But that can't be so unless we change the date, about 1560 to 62, usually assigned to the picture. The Spanish hadn't committed any atrocities by that time, or at least not enough to warrant special attention. Certainly not enough to justify or account for an editorial comment like this painting, anyway. We'll hear a little more later about theories regarding the extent to which Bruegel's art reflects the political and religious context in which he painted, but it's even hard to know for sure that he was anti-Spanish at all. In 1563, after he painted this picture, he moved from more Protestant Antwerp to more Catholic Brussels, which was also the headquarters of the Spanish. Is this something you would do if you had just painted a picture that made the Spanish out to be a plague of skeletons terrorizing the world? I don't think so. We also know that Cardinal Granville had pictures by him hanging on the walls of his house we saw earlier, which is difficult for those who think Brugel was an anti-Spanish Protestant to explain. But I do think Brugel did see things, even like Bosch before the Reformation, from what was an essentially Protestant point of view. The Triumph of Death is sort of like what Luther and even more Calvin imagined Judgment Day will be like. No one deserves salvation. Everyone deserves damnation, and in Bruegel's picture, that's what they're getting. Everyone's being herded into just one giant coffin, you see there at the right. Kings and cardinals, as you can see, are not exempt from this judgment. Protestant hell's a very egalitarian place. In at least the typical traditional views of the Last Judgment before the Reformation, we can figure we have about a 50-50 chance. The saved are on the Lord's right in about equal numbers to the damned on his left. Not so here. This, of course, doesn't mean that Brugel was necessarily a Protestant either. There are examples of this pessimistic view of what's to come in the art and literature of the Church before the Reformation, certainly. More relevant may be simply the fact that he did nothing for the Catholic Church. No church furniture or altar pieces. If he was in fact a Catholic, then he's the first important Catholic painter who didn't do a single altar piece. In fact, we should call him, regardless of his religious background, the first great painter to do nothing for the Church. The Bosch-like pictures we've been seeing make up one category of Bruegel's early work, but he was also painting pictures like this early in his career. This is called The Battle Between Carnival and Lent in the Vienna Art History Museum, and it is in the category of his pictures sometimes called literary tapestries. That's at least a name for the category used by someone whose name I've forgotten. The category is also sometimes called Wimmelbilder, or crowd pictures. The pictures in this category are essentially genre subjects, although sometimes with a theme that keeps them from being purely the depiction of ordinary life. Here the subject is religious only in the most marginal way, however. At the lower center, 2 fellows representing Carnival, the guy with a pig's head stuck on his spear, riding on the beer barrel, and Lent, the guy with the fish on his spear, are engaged in mock combat, while on the left side, the people are engaged in carnival-like activities, eating, drinking, and being merry, and those on the right side, where the church is, are going to just eat fish and are giving alms to the poor. The real purpose of the picture, though, I think, is not to make a religious point, but just to let us see what life was like in downtown Antwerp in about 1560. I've mentioned before how much more attention is paid to ordinary people in the art of Northern Europe generally than is paid to them in the art of Italy at this time. This is another one of those single pictures by a northern artist which has more ordinary people in it than all the paintings by Michelangelo, Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, and Titian combined. And we could throw in El Greco too, just for good measure. How many ordinary Spaniards of the Sancho Panza class get into his paintings? I think Brugel really, in an important sense, has more in common with Cervantes maybe than with El Greco. This picture, called The Blue Cloak in the Berlin State Museum from Brugel's Wimmelbilder period, is one of his most popular. One of the big best-selling books in the Spanish Netherlands in the 16th century was Erasmus's Adages, a collection of some 800 sayings, and Brugel has depicted about 100 or so of them in this picture. In museums, people are sort of awestruck, I think, by the typical giant mythical, religious, or historical or imaginary episodes that make up the work, say, of Peter Paul Rubens, and kind of shrink back from his paintings. Brugel's work, on the other hand, just draws people in like a magnet. If you see a bunch of people gathered on their own in front of a picture as opposed to being herded there by a tour guide, it's probably a Brugel like this. I think one could claim, in fact, that no other painter so rewards close observation. A lot of the adages illustrated here are, of course, ones that ring a bell with us 450 years later. The one which gives the picture its name, however, is not. To wear the blue cloak once meant to have been deceived by one's wife, and a fellow in the lower center there is having a blue cloak put on him by a wife who looks enough younger that she could be suspected of deception, certainly. In this detail, you can see some of the adages illustrated up more closely. The fellow at the lower left is casting roses before swine. We might say to cast pearls before swine, but the point's the same. Two dogs seldom agree over one bone there just above. At the lower center, too, a couple of fellows have made wishes and are breaking a pretzel to see who gets the big half. We break a wishbone, of course. The fellow at the lower right is trying to make ends meet unsuccessfully. The fellow at the lower center with the pink robe has the whorl on his thumb, you see, wrapped around his little finger. In this detail, the fellow at the left center is butting his head against a brick wall while the guy with the cat above him is trying to bell the cat, and he's armed to the teeth, as we say. The fellow at the lower right is filling in a well after the cow's already fallen in. That's like closing the barn door, of course, after the horses run away. The fellow with the big basket of light there is carrying sunshine outside. We say carry coals to Newcastle to make that point. The guy in the lower center is trying to shear a pig. That's to be unclear on the concept. And the two women behind him are spinning a tale. Another category now into which Brugel's pictures fall is that of biblical illustrations, though many of these also have much of the Wimmelbilder about them too. As I said, he did nothing for any church, but the Bible was nevertheless one of his favorite sources of subject matter. This is in fact the Tower of Babel. We know, that is his version thereof, We know that in the early 1550s, Brugel did make the trip to Italy, which was expected of anyone planning to be a serious artist, but there are few signs that any of the great masters had any big influence on him at all. He did make some sketches and a few paintings that make direct use of Italian landscapes or monuments like this one, however. The Tower of Babel is clearly derived from the Colosseum in Rome. But really, for all he learned in Italy, I think he might just as well have stayed home or have gone to Poland or Guatemala or someplace. Some think that there is a point being made here also about the Spanish in the Netherlands. Just as Nimrod at the lower center in this closer view in the Old Testament attempted to build a colossal edifice that irritated the Lord, so is Philip II of Spain attempting on the model of this interpretation to erect an edifice of power that will also bring punishment on him. You can see some of the machines in this detail and laborers at work on this project. And this kind of thing has proven useful to scholars concerned with the technology of building and engineering in the past. The thing is, though, this all looks so impressive, like such a marvel of human ingenuity, that it's hard to believe Brugel intended it to represent folly. It looks too solid. A more rickety empire/Tower of Babel would have been a lot more convincing if Brugel were trying to editorialize about the Spanish here again. This is Brugel's picture of John the Baptist preaching in the Brussels Musée de Beaux-Arts. Another example of a biblical subject used for what amounts to a secular purpose, really. This was probably hung on the wall of a collector along with a Venus or a Diana by Lucas Cranach and perhaps a portrait of the owner of the house. It was not meant, I'm pretty sure, to inspire religious fervor. It's hard here, as often in Brugel's biblical illustrations, even to recognize them as Christian subjects at all. You have to really search for John the Baptist there. He's about in the center wearing a kind of brown hair shirt, as it were. In Brugel's day in the Spanish Netherlands, Protestant preachers sometimes gathered their followers out in the country like this, either by choice or necessity. Those who did this kind of preaching were called hedge preachers, although that doesn't sound like quite the right translation of a Dutch word to me. It's just possible that Brugel meant to make some connection between them and John the Baptist here, preaching in the wilderness, saying that the true way to salvation, the true faith, was at hand. This is another of Brugel's biblical illustrations, but again, it might take you a minute to guess the subject. A lot of Brugel's pictures remind me of the Where's Waldo books my kids used to like. They contain a whole swarm of similar figures, and the idea in the Where's Waldo books is to try to find the significant ones. Here, in this picture by Brugel, I think the key is the guy with the saw over his shoulder at the lower center. That would identify him as a carpenter, Joseph, and behind him comes Mary on the donkey. They're in Bethlehem, of course, going to the office, crowded with eager taxpayers there at the left. Brugel was a worldly fellow despite his reputation as Peasant Brugel. He'd been all the way to southern Italy and knew well enough that the whole world didn't look like a village in the Spanish Netherlands, and I doubt he really thought Palestine looked like this. Some painters who depicted biblical episodes as though they were taking place in Paris or the Black Forest or wherever may have done so simply out of ignorance, but I think Brugel and many others probably gave the biblical stories a familiar setting by way of emphasizing their universality, to keep them from seeming too foreign and therefore maybe less relevant. What Brugel really liked to do best, though, was paint his people in their world, and since pure genre art without any other purpose might have seemed too strange to his clientele, using nominally biblical subject matter was a way to keep from perhaps seeming too avant-garde. Here's the sun setting now in the distance in that painting. This is the Adoration of the Magi, which it is said contains the first falling snow ever painted by a major artist. In fact, Brugel is the first great painter to devote so much time to winter in his pictures, and to some extent that is, of course, because the events surrounding the birth of Christ are winter events. Again, it's hard to find the real subject here. The Magi are actually mostly off the screen at the lower right in this picture. Conversion of Paul by Brugel now in the Vienna Art History Museum, which is the place to go to see the greatest collection of Bruegels. Those who want to see Brugel as a commentator on the political situation in the Netherlands say that Paul here, having been struck blind and fallen from his horse near the center of the picture, again, a bit difficult to find there, represents Alva. The idea is that just as Paul was converted to the true faith on his way to persecute members thereof in Damascus, the Christians, maybe Alva will undergo a similar conversion on his way to Brussels to persecute members of the true faith there, that is, the Protestants. He would be shown, if you buy this theory, passing through the Alps. Alva brought his Spanish army up from Italy across the Alps and down the Rhine. The trouble is that the picture was almost certainly painted before anyone knew Alva was even coming to Brussels.
This is the version of the Massacre of the Innocents, which is now thought to be the original by Brugel. It's in the Royal Collection in London. Some think the black-armored fellow in the center of the troop of soldiers is supposed to be Alva, but this is far from certain. Most of the children have been overpainted with various animals here by a different artist.
Here's a closer view of the picture. I'm always reminded of my birthday by this picture. The Massacre of the Innocents took place according to the traditional church calendar on December 28th, and because of that, December 28th was looked upon as the unluckiest day of the year. People wouldn't even go outside their houses on that day, and the day of the week on which it fell was considered unlucky the whole rest of the year. And December 28th is my birthday. This is the procession with the cross, now also in Vienna, and it has the most people in it of any picture he ever painted, something like 500. Here again, it might take a minute for you to find Christ in all this multitude, but you'll see the cross almost in the center of the picture there. I've mentioned before, of course, that El Greco has hardly anything in common with Brugel, but as we saw in the latter's use of snow, and as we see in the overcast and gloomy sky here, and as we'll see next week in Brugel's landscapes, he, like El Greco, knew the effect weather could have on a picture. And that's something that's entirely foreign to Italian painting in the Renaissance. In this picture, you can see Jesus now having fallen with the cross in the center, surrounded by oafish humanity. At his left now, in this detail, Simon of Cyrene is being commandeered to carry the cross, much against his will. And in this detail from the upper left of the picture, we probably get a view of 16th century Brussels, which is playing the role of Jerusalem in the procession with the cross. Now, to some extent, as I've said, the pictures we've been seeing are genre pictures, but it can be argued that they are not the purest form of this because they are also something else. Illustrations of the contrast between Carnival and Lent, Netherlandish proverbs, the Bible, and so on. H.W. Jansen says, though, that the picture we should regard as the first real pure genre painting by a major artist is Bruegel's Peasant Wedding, which you see now again in Vienna. This is just pure ordinary life, with no ulterior message or implication. It's not the wedding at Cana, it's just the wedding. It's really, of course, more like a wedding reception, a dinner, rather than the actual wedding. The bride is apparently the girl under the bride's crown, as it's called, at the center of the table on the opposite side. The groom's harder to pick out, but he's usually identified as the fellow leaning back at the end of the table on the near side. Some think Brugel is the well-dressed fellow at the right talking to the monk. Again, you have to remember that Brugel is contemporary with Michelangelo and Titian, and this is about as far from their subject matter as you can get. They never painted anything like this. This picture of the Peasant Dance, like some of Brugel's other paintings, exists in more than one version. The one you see here is in Detroit. It seems to represent something like the same event, that is, part of the celebration of the wedding, maybe the dance after or before the dinner. The girl in the center of the picture looks very like the bride in the painting we just saw. That's the reason for connecting the two pictures, I think. Although the man she's dancing with doesn't really look like the fellow usually identified as her husband in the previous picture. At least he's not wearing the same clothes. We're going to look at this and another similar picture by Brugel called The Peasant Dance, and hear an appropriate dance piece by Pierre Falaise to wind up this lecture now. Okay, that's where we'll wind up then. Next time we'll finish Brugel's career, and we still have his great landscapes yet to see. And we'll be in France most of the lecture. See a lot of chateaux, Chenonceau, Chaumont, Amboise. Hear about Pierre de Ronsard and poetry. Hear about the French wars of religion down to the time of Henry IV.